Greetings everybody around the world. It's time once again for Ancient Aliens Radio. This is the dedicated radio show for the cast of Ancient Aliens. Here we interview authors and researchers as an ongoing investigation into the ancient alien theory. Don't forget to like us on Facebook or subscribe to the YouTube channel Ancient Aliens Radio. So today's guest is Michael Cremo. He is an international authority and speaker on archaeological anomalies and extreme human antiquity. He's a best-selling author and researcher associate of the Bhaktivedanta Institute. He specializes in history and the philosophy of silence. He's a member of the World Archaeological Congress and the European Association of Archaeologists. His latest release is My Science, My Religion, and that was published in November 2012. The website for the book is mysciencemyreligion.com, and Michael's website is mcremo.com. That's M-C-R-E-M-O. So I have with me on the line Michael Cremo from LA. Are you there, Michael?
Yes, I am, James. Good to be with you and all radio listeners.
Yeah, we've got quite a growing audience at the moment. I guess a lot of them would be alternative history. But today we're going to go into the extreme antiquity of mankind, Michael, where others may concentrate on alternative history in the era 10,000 to 20,000 BC, say. But just a bit about your background, Michael, and how did you get involved in the extreme antiquity, which I believe is hundreds of thousands to, if not millions of years old?
Well, James, this has something to do with the way I was raised. My father was a military officer in the United States Air Force, and that meant a couple things for me as I was growing up. First, it meant I was living in a lot of different places, including Europe when I was growing up. So that had an influence on me. It made me realize there's more than one way to look at the world. The American way is one way, but there are lots of other people that have other different ways of looking at the world. So that was a big influence on me. And I got exposed to a lot of different worldviews and cultures. So that was a good thing. That was a positive thing for me. For example, when I was 16, I was living in Germany. And on my school vacations, I would go different places in Europe. So one school vacation, I went with a friend of mine up to Sweden, and I was staying in a youth hostel in Stockholm. And I met some kids who had gone overland to Europe. I mean, this was back in the 1960s, so you could do it in those days. It's much more dangerous to try to do it today. But they had gone overland from Europe to India, and they were telling me about all the fantastic things they'd seen in India, the Ganges rivers, different yogis and mystics, and the Himalayan mountains. So I became fascinated with India, and as you kind of grow older, you may have been exposed to a lot of different worldviews, but eventually you've got to construct your own. And I found that the one that was most helpful for me was the worldview of ancient India. That really answered a lot of questions for me. Eventually, I became a disciple of a guru from India, and I studied the ancient Sanskrit writings, especially the Puranas, which are the historical writings. And they had these accounts of human civilizations, human populations going back millions of years. It was something completely different than I'd ever learned from any of my teachers in school or university. In school and university, they were giving the standard theories that humans like us first appeared less than 200,000 years ago, having evolved from more primitive ape-like human ancestors. But in these ancient books of knowledge, they were saying something quite different. And I'm talking not just about, the the traditional wisdom system from India, but a lot of the world's ancient wisdom traditions have this idea that humans have been on Earth for vast periods of time, going back to the very beginnings of the history of life on Earth. So that kind of got me questioning, well, is that just mythology, or is there perhaps some factual basis for it? So that's what got me looking into archaeology. And of course, if you look in the current textbooks, you're only going to see the evidence that goes along with the current dominant theories. But I decided, okay, let me look beyond the textbooks. Let me look into the original scientific reports. And I have a reading knowledge of a lot of the European languages, German, French, Italian. I can't speak them very well, but I can read archaeological reports in them. So I looked at the reports, not just in English, but in a lot of the different European languages, and not just the most recent ones, but I kind of looked back into the earlier history of archaeology as well, going back into the 19th century to the time of Darwin. So when I did that, I found lots of reports of archaeologists and other scientists finding human bones, human artifacts, and human footprints going back much further than 200,000 years or so, going back in some cases many millions of years. So I collected all those reports and I put them together in a book called Forbidden Archaeology. So that's how I got into this whole topic, James.
Very interesting. And I remember you saying once before that, you really did go to the original sources. You followed up all these leads all around the world. You chased them down, if you will, from artifacts, personal collections, museums, written accounts. That must have been quite a long process to compile Forbidden Archaeology. You must have been chasing that information down for quite a while.
Yeah, James. You know what? In the beginning, I was thinking, I didn't know what I would find. I thought, well, maybe I'll do 8 weeks of research. I'll find a few interesting facts. I'll write a short article or booklet about it, and I'll go on to something else because I've got lots of interest. But, that as I got into it, that one case just led to another, and that 8 weeks turned into 8 months, and then the 8 months turned into 8 years of research. It, as you say, it did involve a lot of research. Although in the beginning, I didn't know it was going to turn out like that. But when I started digging into things, one thing just led to another, and it turned out to be 8 years of research that went into the writing of Forbidden Archaeology.
Sure. Now, that was the first book I was introduced to you. I had seen you on many media publications. You speak at conferences. You've been on, I think it was the Mysterious Origins of Man. I first came across Michael Cremo. And finally, I remember you on that, and I felt here's a guy talking sense. He's concise, he's articulate, and he's turning up evidence that's contrary to what we're told, and it really opened up doors for me to look at alternative history in a different light. But you come across what you call the knowledge filtration system as it is, because you upturn bones, footprints, artifacts that contradict the theory of evolution, Michael. But as you can say, could you perhaps explain the knowledge filtration that filters out this information for the listeners today?
Well, here's how I kind of stumbled on that. I started, my research in the history of archaeology, not expecting to find very much in the way of scientific reports for archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity. In other words, reports of evidence that humans were existing much further back in time than most scientists are now prepared to accept. I thought, well, maybe there's a few of them. But I found there were a lot of them. And I was just wondering, why is it that these reports are there in the original scientific literature, but they're not in the textbooks? you know, you know, I, you know, so I thought about it, and I could sort of see that what was going on was a process of knowledge filtration, whereby, the reports that support, the dominant theories, they make their way into the textbooks and the public presentations, but evidence that may be just as good, which happens to contradict a dominant theory, gets filtered out. It gets set aside, ignored, and in some cases actively suppressed. So I call that process of suppression, knowledge, filtration. And it may not be deliberate. The people who may be doing it may be thinking, well, I'm just being a responsible scientist. This doesn't fit in with, the dominant theory, so something must be wrong with it. So I'm just being responsible and not report. But the effect of it is that people don't get the full set of facts with which to make their judgments about, big questions like where did we come from and how long have we been here? So, uh, sometimes, people, ask me, well, why is
this happened, basically?
Why is it going on? And, I think there's a lot of reasons for it. First of all, I think it's just human nature. For example, if I love somebody and somebody tells me something bad about the person I love, I don't want to believe it. And I may even become a little bit angry at the person who tells me these things because it just doesn't fit in with my perception of the person we're talking about. So today, many scientists are very much in love with the Darwinian theory of human origins, and if they hear something that contradicts it, they find it hard to accept, and they may become a little bit angry at people who are bringing forward things like this. So in one sense, I think it's just human nature. But I think it also has something to do with power. There's different kinds of power in the world. There's political power, there's economic power, there's military power, there's also intellectual power, which is a subtle power, but it's a very real one. And generally we see that those who have power, particularly monopoly power, don't like to give it up very easily. So today, the scientists who are supporters of the Darwinian theory of evolution, generally in most countries, they have a government-enforced monopoly in the education systems. They're able to ensure that only their ideas are taught and other ideas are excluded. So generally we see that those who have monopoly power like to keep it. For example, if one corporation has a monopoly in a certain sector of the economy, it doesn't want to give up its position. Or if one political party has a monopoly in the political life of a community or a nation, it doesn't like to give up its position very easily. So similarly, those who have a monopoly in the education system and the scientific institutions, they don't like to give up their monopoly position very, very, very easily. And I think what I've been able to do in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, was not only document evidence for extreme human antiquity, but I've also been able to document how the knowledge filtering process operates in particular cases.
Sure. I think one good example of that, Michael, is I remember in Forbidden Archaeology, there's a lovely appendix at the back for extreme antiquity and artifacts. And the Nampa figurine, you actually say, that the very effort by mainstream to explain this object away could also be used to explain their own evidence away. It's the same theory, or the same method of explaining away facts can be used for both sides.
Yeah, that's right. That Nampa image you're talking about, that was a figurine of a female human-like figure that came up from a well that was being drilled near the town of Nampa in the state of Idaho in the United States. The drilling of the well had gone down about 300 feet. It's about 100 meters. And, the drill had gone down through many different layers of rock. And finally at, the 300-foot level, this human figurine was brought up. And, I consulted modern geologists about the age of the geological formations at this place. I had a copy of the drilling record, how the drill had gone down through so many feet of this kind of rock and so many feet of that kind of rock down to that 300-foot level. So we asked modern geologists from the state of Idaho, how old is the formation down at that 300-foot level? And they said, well, that's about 2 million years old. So there are many scientists who just can't accept, that humans could have existed that far in the past, humans like us. They may believe some type of ape man existed, but they don't believe that humans with developed intelligence capable of making statues and figurines existed at that time. They think that sort of thing, according to the normal theories, started about 20 or 30,000 years ago. So to have this sort of evidence at 2 million years or even more was just impossible for scientists to accept. So they started coming up with explanations. Well, it must have been a figurine that kind of slipped down from the surface through some kind of fissure. And, they didn't demonstrate that any such fissure existed. They just said, well, that's what had to have happened.
Yeah, extreme methods to explain it away, though, Michael. Extreme methods.
Yeah, but you could explain away any evidence like that, even the evidence that supports the current theories. You could explain it away like that. So, one feature of this knowledge filtering process is what I call a double standard in applying procedures for judging. The case of the Nampa image that you brought up is a good example of that, where a double standard was applied. Where in the case of evidence that doesn't fit the theories, you're free to invent all kinds of ways in which it could be wrong. But if you applied those same standards to the evidence that's now in the textbooks, you'd have to throw all that out as well. So it's just another example of how the knowledge filtering process operates.
I suppose, before we get into some artifacts, has there been, just on a personal note, has there been any acceptance of evidence or research or these artifacts, or even discussion from mainstream? Has it soaked up to anybody yet?
Well, it has, in this sense that if ideas are going to change, the first thing is that scientists have to be willing to listen to alternative evidence and different kinds of ideas. And I have found that within the scientific world, within the community of archaeologists, there are some who are willing to listen to new ideas and evidence that contradicts the current theories. Therefore, I've been able to speak at major international conferences of archaeology and present some of this evidence. Now, that isn't, I'm not going to pretend that everyone who hears me immediately changes their minds and starts to agree with me. But I think the fact that at least some scientists are willing to listen to new ideas is a hopeful sign. Now, among those who do listen to me, some agree with me, and they're few in number at this time, because that's how things work in the world of science. But I would say it's a hopeful sign.
Yeah. I think we're in a new paradigm. I think it's got a long way to go, but a lot more people are open to alternative history than, say, 10 years ago. There's definitely a shift in consciousness. You can see it in people, and a lot of new radio shows popping up too, discussing a lot of this stuff too, Michael. So perhaps for the new listeners, let's talk about some artifacts, Michael, because this is what really sells it for me. You've upturned some very, very interesting evidence, and it's actually the variety of artifacts that come up too, Michael. There's looks like engineered artifacts. There's as you say, the Nampa figurine. There's coins. There's human footprints and bones, and perhaps the most fascinating one that grabs me first is the South African metallic spheres, because I think that's the most extreme antiquity you have uncovered yet. Is that right?
Yes, they're puzzling artifacts. If you read what I have to say about them in Forbidden Archaeology, they're what they are is they're round objects. I call them metallic because they're made of hematite, which is a naturally occurring type of iron ore. And it's actually considered a semi-precious stone. You can find jewelry made of hematite. But miners in South Africa have found many of these round metallic objects. They're 1 or 2 inches in diameter. And, the most interesting is the grooves that go around the center of each object. Some of them have 2 grooves, some have 3, some have 4. And you were mentioning a little bit earlier that you made a reference to the television documentary Mysterious Origins of Man, and the producer of that documentary had gotten in touch with me, and he wanted to include some cases from Forbidden Archaeology in the documentary. So these round metallic spheres that come from South Africa are one of the cases that he chose to include in the documentary. Now, what's really interesting about these things is they're found in mineral deposits over 2 billion years old, which is really quite astonishing. And the question is, are these things something that would form naturally in the layers of the earth, or do we have to invoke some kind of human intelligence being involved in their manufacture? So it's interesting. This documentary, Mysterious Origins of Man, was shown on NBC, which was one of the big American television networks. But, before NBC would allow these spheres to be included in the documentary, they told the producer, you have to give them to an independent company of metallurgists for examination. So that was done. And the metallurgists said, they could not explain how these things could have formed naturally in the layers of the earth. which means that you have to consider that if they can't be explained naturally, that you would have to invoke some kind of human intelligence being involved in their production up to 2 billion years ago. Now, I'll say this: if somebody can come up with a convincing, geologically realistic and proven explanation of how they could have formed naturally in the earth, then I'd be prepared to admit that. But at the present moment, I really haven't encountered anything that rises to that level of certainty. I mean, there are people who make all kinds of claims about how they could have formed naturally, but I haven't really seen any other good example of grooves being formed with such precision. It's so I would say, you have to understand one thing, is that I'm open to changing my mind about any of the cases that I've reported in Forbidden Archaeology if somebody can give me convincing reasons to do so. But at this particular moment, I'm still open to the possibility that those metallic spheres from South Africa with the parallel grooves going around the center of them are produced by human beings.
Sure, and I'm from an engineering background, mostly mechanical, and I've studied metallurgy too, Michael, for my degree, and from the same perspective, they just look engineered to me. That's from an engineer. I can't see any natural process that would do that. They certainly do. They're such a fascinating object and you've actually gone to South Africa yourself and seen these in the bedrock. Is that correct?
Yeah. A few years ago, I went to South Africa. I had gone there to speak at universities and speak at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress that was held in Cape Town. And when I was in Johannesburg, I made an appointment to meet the chief mining engineer from the mine where these objects were found. And see, one kind of skeptical doubt about these objects is, well, maybe, there are round hematite concretions, but then somebody maybe took one of those naturally occurring round hematite concretions and then kind of engraved the grooves around them. But this mining engineer, from the mine told me that's not really a good explanation. He showed me a solid block, a huge block of mineral from the mine that had these round objects solidly embedded in them, kind of like, you could say, like raisins in a dough, something. Yeah. And some of them were halfway protruding out of the rock, and I could see the grooves on these objects that were solidly embedded in the rock going back into the solid rock. So I did see that personally when I was in South Africa, having a meeting with the chief mining engineer from the mine from which these objects come.
Sure. How many objects are there, Michael? How many of these spherical balls are there?
Well, there are apparently a lot of them. I don't know the exact number, but it's interesting. This mining engineer had sent me to America, some specimens which were used in the filming of the documentary, The Mysterious Origins of Man. I mean, there's quite a few of them. I understand. I don't have any idea of what the exact number is, but there's a photograph of one of them in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, and that photograph had been sent to me by Rolf Marx, who was the director of the museum in which that specimen was being kept. It was the Natural History Museum in Klerksdorp, South Africa. And it was interesting, when the book was published, a Dutch television producer saw the picture and the description, and he wanted to go down to South Africa and film that particular object, and the one in the museum. So I put him in touch with the director of the museum, but the museum director reported that that particular object had been stolen from the museum. It was really, he said it had been stolen by a person he characterized as a white witch. So I hope it's being put to good use somewhere.
Oh, please God it is. Just in terms of artifacts that look engineered, the Illinois coin is one that's really fascinating as well, Michael. And I was just looking at a picture of it today, and it's so eerily similar to the Irish modern 50p. We're now in the euro currency at the moment, but the old Irish 50p from a decade ago, it just looks like a modern coin, but it's found at a layer that's somewhere between 200 to 400,000 years old. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was discovered in the United States, in the state of Illinois. I think the place was Lawn Spring that it was found at, and it was in the 19th century. And again, this was a case of a well boring. A well was being drilled at this location, and it went down about 114 feet. And at that level, this copper object, which is in the shape of looks like a coin, came up. And on the surface of this copper coin-like object, there are human figures and an inscription in an unknown script. And it was reported by a researcher from the Smithsonian Institution in the United States, a scientific research institution, and it was published in an academic journal. And in that report, published in an academic journal, there was the drilling record, that the drill had gone down through 5 feet of sand and 6 feet of clay and 3 feet of rock. It had the whole drilling record. So what we did is we gave the drilling record to geologists of the State Geological Survey of Illinois, and we asked them, how old is the formation down at that 114-foot level? And they reported back. We didn't tell them about the coin. We just gave them because sometimes if you do that, then they
I know
they don't answer you. So we just made it a simple request, gave them the drilling record, told them where it was from, and they said, well, that level that you're talking about is from the Yarmouthian Formation. It's between 200,000 and 400,000 years old. Now that's really quite interesting, because according to the current theories, the oldest coins are only about 3,000 years old. They come from a place called Lydia, which is now within the boundaries of the modern country of Turkey. So to have this kind of thing going on, perhaps as much as 400,000 years ago, is really quite extraordinary. According to modern theories, there weren't any anatomically modern humans at that time. There were no civilizations. There was no artwork. There was no developed economies and things like that. So it's really kind of an extraordinary discovery. But it's been filtered out of modern archaeology.
And the reason I say it looks like the modern Irish 50p was to give you that, this may be such an extreme antiquity. It just looks like something we create today, and it's a polygonal shape. I think there's 7 sides on it, and there's 7 sides on the Irish and the Old English 50p as well. So it really does like something modern we could come up with today, but, just we're going to come up to a break very soon, Michael. I just want to probably just talk about another couple of artifacts that occur in coal deposits, because coal miners have upturned some stuff, and that's very important too because of the formation of coal. Perhaps you could just give us an example on that.
Yes, many objects have turned up in coal deposits, and many of these reports are from the 19th century because in those days the coal mining was pretty much hands-on. Today it's all done with huge machines, and they grind everything up, but from those earlier days there were many interesting reports of things being found in coal. Sometimes human bones were found in coal deposits. There was a case that was reported in a scientific journal called The Geologist from the 19th century that told of an anatomically modern human skeleton being found 90 feet deep in coal deposits in the state of Illinois. It was in Macoupin County, Illinois, and according to the scientific report, above the coal deposit there was a thick layer of slate rock that extended for hundreds of meters in all directions, and that layer of slate rock was unbroken, which kind of rules out the possibility that the human skeleton could have come down from some higher, more recent level into the coal deposit. And the coal deposit was about 300 million years old, according to modern geologists from the state of Illinois. And there was another case from the same state of Illinois. There was a case of a woman named Mrs. Robert Culp, who was putting a big piece of coal into her coal-burning stove. And the piece of coal, it was a big one, so she broke it in half. And inside this piece of coal, she found a gold chain about 10 inches long. And, from this report, we got the name of the mine that the coal came from. And, we did a little research with the State Geological Survey of Illinois, and they said the coal from that particular mine is again about 300 million years old. And then there was another case from the state of Oklahoma in the United States. There's a town called Heavener, Oklahoma. And outside that town, there was a coal mine that had gone down about 2 miles into the earth. And, the coal miners, they were blasting out what they call rooms with dynamite. That's how they operated. They would explode some dynamite to blast out what they would call a room, and then they would bring the coal out. So as they were bringing the coal out after a blast like that, they found at one end of the tunnel, or the room as they called it, a wall made of 6-inch blocks of stone that were perfectly polished so that you could see your reflection in them, basically. And when the miners reported that to the company officials. They just took them out of the mine, closed the mine, sent the miners to another mine to work. And again, those coal deposits are about 300 million years old. So there are a lot of interesting things that have been found in coal mines. Now, some of these things are reported in scientific literature, so we hear about them. But I think my suspicion is that a lot more was discovered by miners that just never really got reported in any type of scientific literature.
It's only a small percentage gets out, I think, Michael. That's the thing.
Yeah, they may have, found something interesting and just kept it on the mantelpiece in the home, and then maybe when they died, then the relatives just thought, "What's this junk?" and threw it away. So I suspect if you went back into some coal mining areas and talked to the miners, especially the ones who were operating before everything became completely mechanized, you'd encounter some pretty interesting things from coming from coal mines.
Sure. Michael, we're just going to come up to a break, and I want to get into some of your work with Sanskrit knowledge, and also your new book publication, My Science, My Religion. So just pause it right there, Michael, and be back in just a moment. With me on the line, Michael. You there, Michael?
Yes, I am. Yes,
Hi, Michael.
I'm right here.
Sure. So, as I say, Michael, I could talk forever about ancient artifacts, and you've provided such a wealth. I urge anybody who hasn't read Forbidden Archaeology to go out and get it, because it's a good starting point, I think, for people with your work, Michael. But your latest publication from November 2012 is called My Science, My Religion. What's the elements of your newest work, Michael?
Well, this book includes 24 papers that I've presented at mainstream scientific conferences, mostly on archaeology or history of science. And these papers deal with the kind of evidence that I've reported in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, and with other topics that I'm also interested in. After, people read my book, Forbidden Archaeology, they said, well, you've got all this evidence that contradicts the current theories of human origins. So do you have any alternative explanation for where we came from? So to answer that question, I wrote a book called Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And in that book, I said, before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from, we should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? Now today, many scientists will say we're just machines made of matter. That's what we are. And as far as consciousness is concerned, they would say, well, if you combine the atoms in the brain or the molecules in the brain in a very complex way, they produce what we call consciousness, but only temporarily and only in association with the brain. When the molecules are disorganized at the time of death, then there's no more consciousness. So it's a very materialistic conception of what we are. But what I'm proposing in my book, Human Devolution, is that consciousness exists separately from matter. It has its own independent existence. And what we are originally is beings of pure consciousness. So under that conception, we don't evolve up from matter, as many scientists now believe. Rather, we devolve or come down from the level of pure consciousness. So there's some scientific evidence that shows consciousness has its own independent existence. This evidence comes from medical studies of out-of-body experiences, psychiatric studies of past life memories, and things like that. So that's another topic that I talk about in some of my scientific papers that I've presented at scientific conferences, evidence for consciousness existing apart from matter. So as I said, in my book, My Science, My Religion, there are 24 papers presented at mainstream scientific conferences where I talk about these things. And the reason I think that's important is that when many people hear about the kinds of things that we're talking about, archaeological evidence that contradicts the current theories, evidence for consciousness existing apart from matter, they think, well, that is just stuff that you're going to hear about on, in the tabloid newspapers or on, wildly sensationalistic radio or TV programs. But whatever it is, it's not part of science. So what I wanted to show in this book, My Science, My Religion, is that these things are part of modern scientific discussion. And the proof of it is these papers that I presented at major international scientific conferences. And another thing that this book shows is that it's not true that science and religion have to be completely separate. I'm very open in my scientific presentation about the spiritual inspiration for my work. I'm very open that my work is inspired by my studies in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, the spiritual text of ancient India. So I think it's very important for people to understand that science and religion are not, as many people believe, completely separate endeavors.
I think people would like to think there's a disconnect there, but I don't think that's true anymore, Michael. And definitely with your research, you seem to be providing this platform where people can really indulge in it, and you're providing something that hasn't been there before, Michael, I think too. Could you elaborate on some of the papers in the book that deal with archaeology, Michael?
Well, the first paper that I presented at a scientific conference was in 1994. I went to a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress. Now, that's one of the world's largest international organizations of archaeologists, and they have a meeting every 4 years in a different country. So that year, 1994, they held their meeting in New Delhi, India. And I thought, well, this is the perfect place for me to present my ideas. So I presented a paper there called Puranic Time and the Archaeological Record. So the Puranas are the historical writings of ancient India, and they have a cyclical concept of time, where time goes in vast cycles. But according to the Puranas, humans have been present throughout all these vast cycles of time. So I believe there's archaeological evidence that supports that, and I have reported it in my book, Forbidden Archaeology. But I also presented it in this paper, Puranic Time and the Archaeological Record. Now, when you present a paper at a scientific conference, first of all, you have to submit a proposal, and they can accept it or reject it. So I thought it was significant that they accepted my proposal to accept this paper where I explained the time concept in ancient India and the archaeological evidence that shows that humans existed throughout all these vast cycles of time. And not only was the paper accepted for presentation at this major international scientific conference, it was later published in a peer-reviewed scientific book called Time and Archaeology that was published by Routledge, a major scientific publisher. Now, so sometimes people want to ask me, well, do you have peer-reviewed scientific publications? And the answer is yes. And many people find that, very surprising, but it is a fact.
Sure. And some of your papers involve paranormal research. Could you tell us about them, Michael?
Well, yes. There's not only a forbidden archaeology, there's also a forbidden physics. In my alternative conception of human origins, I recognize three things. First of all, the body made of molecules, made of ordinary matter. That's part of what we are as human beings. But beyond that, there is a subtle mind element that has some very unusual powers. You might call them paranormal powers, like remote viewing and extrasensory perception and psychokinesis, mind over matter types of abilities. So when many people hear about such things, they think, well, this is just totally outside the bounds of acceptable science. But I think such people aren't really aware of the actual history of science, which I've talked about in some of my scientific papers that are included in this book, My Science, My Religion. And I've spoken about these things at major international science conferences, for example, conferences on consciousness studies in science. And here's an example of one of the cases that I presented in these scientific papers. Many people have heard of Marie and Pierre Curie. They're mentioned in every introductory physics book. They were husband and wife. They were working in Paris, France, early in the 20th century, and they got Nobel Prizes for their work in discovering radium and the phenomenon of radioactivity when that was first being developed early in the 20th century. So that's in every physics textbook. But what you don't read in the physics textbooks is that they were heavily involved in psychical research into the paranormal. They were part of 20 prominent European scientists who were studying such things in Paris early in the 20th century. And this group of scientists was doing research into a medium, an Italian lady named Eusapia Palladino, who had psychokinetic abilities, mind over matter abilities. So the experiments with this woman medium took place at the Psychology Institute in Paris. And on one occasion, they had the medium in the laboratory. Marie Curie was holding her hands. Other scientists were holding her feet, making sure she couldn't move at all. And in the middle of the lab, in broad daylight, Pierre Curie, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said that a large table was floating about 1 meter off the ground in the presence of this woman. Said he felt all around, there weren't any wires or anything. This table was floating there in the presence of all these scientists, including Marie and Pierre Curie. It's not something you're going to read about in the physics textbooks, but it's part of the actual history of physics that I've reported in some of my scientific papers that are included in this new book, My Science, My Religion.
Right. Are there precedents that exist for this work? Are there historical figures that have reconciled science and religion that you have done, Michael?
Well, yes, there are. And one of them is a pretty interesting character. It's Alfred Russel Wallace. Was, along with Darwin, the co-founder of the theory of evolution by natural selection. Originally, the theory was called the Wallace-Darwin theory, because actually Darwin had been working on the theory for a long time, for 20 years, before he published The Origin of Species. So one day, before he published The Origin of Species, he got a letter from Wallace in which Wallace laid out the whole theory of evolution by natural selection. And Darwin was shocked. Wallace was going to publish a paper about it, and the person who publishes it first gets their name on it, a theory. So Darwin was very upset by this, so he consulted with his scientific friends, and they told him, well, the only thing you could possibly do is get Wallace to agree that you would both present papers at an English scientific society at the same time, on the same day, and that way you'll both get credit for the theory. So that's what happened. Wallace and Darwin presented papers on the same day at the Linnaean Society in London, and the proceedings were later published, and therefore they both got credit for the theory. So for a long time it was called the Wallace-Darwin theory, but Wallace's name was taken off of it when he got involved in psychical research into the paranormal. So Wallace sort of combined his interest in the paranormal with his ideas about evolution, but Darwin just hated that. And, so Wallace's name kind of got pushed from the theory. But Wallace was a person who was able to combine his spiritual and his scientific interests in what I regard as a very interesting way. And there have been other scientists who have also been able to do that, but I think Wallace is a good example of it.
Right. So another one of the papers gives a spiritual perspective on the environmental crisis. Could you, just for the listeners, share something about that?
Well, that's one of my interests, the environmental crisis. And what I've found is that researchers who've looked deeply into it see that ultimately it's a spiritual problem that demands a spiritual solution. What the root of the environmental crisis is our tendency to overproduce and overconsume material things. Basically, that's what's causing the environmental destruction and pollution. We're building so many factories that are producing so many material things, and that's poisoning the earth, poisoning the land, poisoning the water. So if we're really going to solve this environmental crisis, it means we're going to have to voluntarily reduce the level of material production and consumption. And that is ultimately, I think, a spiritual problem that has to deal with the amount of greed that's there in the human heart. And how is that going to be reduced? I think it can only be reduced by spiritual practices that give people non-material happiness and consumption. In other words, there are spiritual techniques that can give people some inner happiness and satisfaction, so they won't be searching so much for external means of satisfaction. So I talked about that at a major international conference on environmental studies, and it's one of the papers that's included in this book, My Science, My Religion.
India is fascinating too. Tell us a little bit about the history of archaeology in India itself, as you've outlined in some of the academic papers. I think that's important too, Michael.
Well, a lot of people think that archaeology began with European and American scientists. And say if you look at a standard history of archaeology in India, they say, well, archaeology began in India when European travelers came there in the 17th century and started digging up things and writing about ancient ruins that they found there. So that's what you see in the textbooks. And even Indian archaeologists, they accept that. But what I found in my studies is that there was an independent archaeological tradition in India that existed, before the Europeans came there. And it involves things like different saints and mystics seeing in dreams and visions the locations of lost sacred images and sacred places. And they would go to these places and dig, and they would find what they saw in their dreams and visions. So they excavated these objects, these ancient objects, sacred images mostly, and built new temples to house them and things like that. So that is a kind of spiritual archaeology that I think deserves to be called archaeology. And I've presented papers on this spiritual archaeological tradition in India at meetings of the European Association of Archaeologists and the European Association of South Asian Archaeology and Art. And one of my papers on this topic was published in Antiquity, which is one of the main scientific journals on archaeology. It's published in England, actually. So it's an interesting topic, and I think there are other examples of it from other places in the world of indigenous archaeological traditions, and many archaeologists are very interested in this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my fiance is a horticulturist, so she's going to love this next question. In chapter 13, it features a fascinating study of the anomalous fossil evidence for extreme antiquity of plants. Can you explain this phenomenon for us, Michael?
Yeah. My main topic, of course, is extreme human antiquity, evidence showing that humans like us were present millions, even hundreds of millions of years ago. So sometimes some people have asked me, well, is it just that our picture of human history needs to be reformed and reconstructed on the basis of the kind of evidence that you're talking about? But what about other species, plants and animals, for example? Is perhaps our view of their history also in need of revision? And I think the answer to that question is yes. Of course, I've really focused on the human species, because that's what most of us human beings are concerned with. I found evidence that perhaps our picture of the origin of different plant species also needs to be radically revised. The current picture of the origin of flowering plants is that flowering plants first came into existence about 100 million years ago, maybe 150 million years ago at most. And when I say flowering plants, the technical term for them is angiosperms. And they include not just roses and lilies and things like that, but most of the plants that we use for food are from the flowering plant or angiosperm family. All the grains that we eat, the vegetables, the fruits, they come from the flowering plant family. So, as I said, the standard scientific conception today is that the flowering plants came into existence about 100 million years ago. But I was doing some research, and I found some scientific reports that show that the flowering plants actually first emerged or were present 500 or 600 million years ago, at a time when most scientists think there weren't any forms of life, either plant or animal, on the land at all. So this evidence comes from the Salt Range Mountains in what's now Pakistan. In the 1930s and 40s, scientists were researching that area. It was part of India at that time. And they were looking into some salt mines in the Salt Range Mountains. And over a mile deep in these salt mines and sedimentary deposits that were found there, these scientists found evidence for the existence of flowering plants in formations from the Cambrian period that goes back over 500 million years. So in one of my scientific papers, I reported on this evidence, and that paper is included in this book, My Science, My Religion.
Fascinating, Michael. You know, it's strange you mentioned that. I'm sitting with a piece of Himalayan rock salt from the Pakistan mines that you just spoke about in front of me. It's a candle holder, which I always set at light for all my radio shows. It's so strange.
Yeah, part of my research, I went to that salt mine. It's in the Kura Gorge in the Range Mountains in Pakistan. And it's the kind of salt that comes out of there is of a pinkish color.
That's right. It's a pink rock salt that I have, and my fiance is big into health, and we've both become vegetarians in the last recent while, and we're now taking this Himalayan rock salt as an alternative to normal salt. You make up a solution in a bottle and stuff. It's supposed to have something like 84 different benefits, so it's a fascinating substance.
Yeah, many people like the natural salts, especially coming from that, that rock salt from those Himalayan mines in Pakistan and the Salt Range Mountains was traded widely over the Indian subcontinent. And you mentioned being a vegetarian. I've been a vegetarian for over 40 years now. I find it's very good, for my mental and spiritual health.
Well, I'm feeling the difference again. I have tried on 3 occasions, and I struggle. I've got such a high metabolism, but the thing is, I actually do like beans and I do like my greens, and it's adopting a new regime and committing, and eventually you just fall into place. So I'm so scared with meat products.
It's up to each individual, but I've been doing it for 40 years. But back to the salt, it comes from very deep mines in the Salt Range Mountains. And what the researchers found at that time is that there'd be a layer of salt, and then there'd be a layer of sediments, and then another layer of salt, and another layer of sediments. And it was in the layers of sediments between the layers of salts that they were finding evidence for the existence of flowering plants. They were finding plant tissues and plant pollen.
Right.
Characteristic of the angiosperms or flowering plant family. So kind of interesting. A little bit of synchronicity going on here that we actually have some.
Yeah, I'm sitting there, and it's a new thing for me. This Himalayan rock salt, and and I need the science of the benefits of the nutrition to get attracted to it. But she does all the research, and then she comes up with some stuff, and I feel better for it. I really do feel better for it, which I have to say. So
got a good partnership going on there.
Yeah, she has encouraged me, and she's very much the nurturer. She's as Walter Cruttenden said the other night, she's a keeper. Yeah, so. For sure. Michael, I got to wrap it up here because I'm over the hour as I thought I would be with yourself. How have scientists reacted to this integral connection of science and spirit that you're giving us here today for My Science, My Religion book?
Well, there's basically three reactions. Of course, there's a group of hardcore, materialistic, atheistic scientists who don't very much like what I'm doing. They don't want to hear it. They'd rather nobody else would hear it. So that element is there. But then there's another element that's a little more open-minded. They might not necessarily agree with me, but they're willing to listen to a presentation of ideas that integrate science and spirituality. And then there are they're few in number, who actually agree with me. And sometimes, you'd often be surprised. For example, once I was invited to speak about the hidden history of physics at a science university in Europe. Actually, it was in Hungary. And I spoke to an audience of about 100 physicists and graduate students of physics about physicists who have studied, these unusual things, like the Curies, who were engaged studying mediums. And, I went through this whole hidden history of physics with them. And I was wondering what they were going to say. So one physicist came up to me and he said, I think it's very interesting that you're talking about these things. He says, I'm a plasma physicist. By day I'm studying the effects of superheated gases, things like that. But he said, privately, I'm doing some experiments in telepathy. He said, I have a son, he's 8 years old, and I put him in another room and I flip a coin and he's got to guess if it's heads or tails. And he said, my son is getting 80% correct. He said, and he told me, he says, I wouldn't tell this to any of my colleagues, but I feel safe in speaking to you about it. So, as I travel around the world, I find there aren't many scientists like that who by day appear perfectly orthodox and materialistic in their science, but really they have other interests that verge into the paranormal and the spiritual. But they feel they're not able to openly discuss it. So, but there are some who are openly discussing these things, but they are few in number at the present moment.
Sure. So, look, Michael, I'm going to wrap it up there because just before I do, could you just tell us a little bit about intelligent design? I've just finished reading a book called Rethinking Darwin, which you contributed a chapter to. My friend is actually in Denmark, gave me a copy last week, just because I told him I had a show coming up about Darwin. But just for the listeners, because I know you I didn't know at the time, but I know you contributed a chapter to that. But just Could you just tell us about the intelligent design and that challenge of Darwinian evolution? What's the difference, really?
Well, both ordinary Darwinists and intelligent design theorists see that there's a lot of complexity in biological systems. Now the question becomes, well, how does this complexity arise? One idea is, well, it arises by evolution by natural selection. But if you look in any scientific publication, you don't find any exact explanations of how that actually occurs. For example, you won't find, today, evolution operates on the idea that, well, there's variation in the genetic structure of living things that results in changes in the physical structure. And they say, well, that's how the complexity arises. But say if you look at something like the eye, it's a very complex structure. And, they would say, well, maybe a long time ago there was some little animal that didn't have a developed eye. Maybe it had just a light sensitive spot. And they would say by genetic changes, the physical structure changed so that gradually that light sensitive spot turned into the human eye. So that's what you read in the textbooks. But if you ask, well, what was the exact sequence of genetic changes that took place over those many millions of years that led to the formation of the eye? You can't find any detailed scientific explanation of how that actually happened. They'll just say we're working on it.
Sure, it's a guesswork, really.
But,
it's guesswork.
But the intelligent design theorists say that some of this complexity is irreducible. It's not something that could happen in a step-by-step fashion. No, certainly nobody has explained exactly what those steps are. So they would propose that intelligence is necessary in order to explain the level of complexity that we observe. Just like, if you see, a smartphone sitting on your desk and you ask, well, where did that come from? You naturally think, well, it was designed and engineered, by some intelligent agency. Some intelligent engineer designed it, built it. You don't think, well, it just came about by a series of accidental, just have a bunch of elements sitting around and they start combining themselves on their own into that complex form. So intelligent design is one of the alternatives that are out there in the scientific world to the Darwinian theory of evolution. But many scientists don't like it because it involves, intelligent agency. But I'm in favor of intelligent design. As far as it goes, I think you have to go beyond even that. Because intelligent design just deals with things on the material level. That you've got some material complexity, and they would say you need design to explain the complexity. But I think there's more to living systems than just molecules. There's non-material substances. There's a subtle mind element with some very unusual powers. And then there's a conscious non-material self that can exist apart from matter. And I think that's got to be part of the picture too. But if we're just talking about the material aspect of things, I think you've got to invoke intelligent design.
Okay, so Michael, we're at the top of the hour. It's been a pleasure having you. If you want to just give out your websites again, Michael, for your new book and your personal site.
Okay, my personal site is mcremo.com, mcremo.com. That will have a list of my upcoming lectures and interviews and information about all of my books. My most recent book, My Science, My Religion, has its own dedicated website, mysciencemyreligion.com. So listeners could check that out if they like.
Sure, and I'm going to have your full biography up on Capricorn Radio's webpage too. Again, Michael, thanks for having you. You have such an invaluable research, detailed, very concise and clearly laid out in your work and your publications, and thorough scholarship. Yeah, you've been a real credit to the last 10 years of paradigm shift, I think, and before that even. But it's been a pleasure having you on the show, Michael.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Michael. We hope to talk to you again soon.
I'd like that.